Okay, I want to share my screen. Okie dokie, looks good. All right, welcome. Welcome back to Responsive Week here at FEWD22. So last class we basically learned all of the basic building blocks that we need to make responsive websites. And today's class is all about putting those things into practice in a lab exercise that we started at the very end of last class. And then after that, we're going to do a little introduction into a popular CSS framework called Bootstrap. Yeah, and it's actually not part of the official curriculum, but I wanted to add it because we teach jQuery because it's so ubiquitous. If anything, Bootstrap is even more ubiquitous. Almost every project you work on will use Bootstrap to some degree, and so being familiar with it and how it works is helpful for that reason. It's also helpful because it can save you a lot of time. A lot of the stuff that we've been doing, manually writing our own CSS is taken care of in that framework. So we'll spend a little bit of time looking at that, and then we'll go back to the lab and use Bootstrap to kind of do some more things that we did by hand. Okay, so today's objectives are to put those techniques that we learned last class into practice, and we'll review them briefly at the beginning before jumping into the lab. And then after that, we'll go right into Bootstrap. An agenda, basically what I just said. Okay, so let's do a little bit of quick review. So we talked about sort of the evolution of responsive websites, right? So early 2000s, late 90s, right? There was no need for responsive websites. Everybody who was on the internet was looking at it on a desktop device, right? For the most part, there's no mobile traffic, surely, and also there was very little variation in the screen size of desktop computers. And so as these new devices, smaller devices, everywhere on the spectrum became more widely available, more widely used, all of a sudden there was this problem, and that problem was, my site looks great on this screen size, but not all of these other screen sizes. And the first attempt to fix that problem was I would just create a different site for each type of device. So I would have my mobile website. And you'll still see this sometimes where you go to like m.dot some website. So in the back in the day, it's like facebook.com would be the desktop site. Maybe there would be an m.facebook.com that stands for mobile. It was just a separate site that was optimized for mobile. So that was sort of the first stab at it. But that becomes a problem because now there's not just small mobile devices, there's tablets, there's every size of tablet. Smartphones vary in size from the 6 Plus or whatever Android equivalent to the the SE, which is around 5 inches, 4.8 inches or something like that. So there's a lot of variation in screen size. So it's unfeasible to create a different website for each of these screen sizes. So what we have to do is make our websites respond to different screen sizes and look good basically on any of those screen sizes. And so what happened was, the creators of CSS saw this problem on the horizon, and they said, well, let's put something into CSS, into the CSS standard that will solve for this problem, and that was media queries, right? And so these media queries are a feature of CSS that allow you to target your CSS rules to specific device types and specific device features, as in screen size, orientation, etc. And what we saw is they look like this. This is the syntax for a media query. So this top line is not a real media query. I'm showing you what the parts are. So the first thing is the media type. What we typically use there is screen, right? A screen device, which is a phone or a computer or a tablet. Those are all screen devices. There are other types of devices. A popular one is like print, right? Do we want our site to look different on print than it does on a computer, for instance? And we could have a media query specific for print if we wanted to. And then after that, we have some media feature. The one we typically use is max width or min width, something having to do with the how wide is the screen, right? Because that's really what we're responding to. And then the value that we're going to give that. And so down here at the bottom, this is what a real media query might look like. So this is saying a screen device, so like a computer or a tablet, that has a maximum width of 992 pixels. Okay, so any screen device that has a screen width that's less than 992 pixels, this thing is going to work for. Okay, so that's the raw media query, disembodied. Here's what it looks like when we use it typically, right? So this is, I should turn my volume off. This is what it looks like in a CSS style sheet, okay? So last class we talked about you can also put these inline in your link tags. However, in practice, you almost never see that. Maybe for print styles, you might do that, just have a completely separate style sheet. But for making responsive sites, in practice, you don't really see that. And so I've just kind of left it off of this review altogether. I put it on mute. I don't know. I'll figure that out later. Anyway, so this is what it looks like in a CSS style sheet. Right? So we have this app media, so showing that this is a media query, and then the query itself. So this is, again, screen devices, computers, tablets, mobile phones, that have a maximum width of 799 pixels in this case. And what this means is whenever this media query is true, whenever the device matches that, apply any of the CSS rules that are within that media query. Okay? So in this case, on a large screen, a screen that has a larger width than 799 pixels, we might see a featured image that has a 30% width. As soon as we're on a device that has a width that's less than 799 pixels, all of a sudden that width is going to change to 100%. The CSS width of the featured image will change to 100%. Okay. Now, we talked about last class why we put this below the non-media queried CSS rule here. Can anybody remind me why we put it below the non-media queried CSS rule?
Right.
Exactly. If we put it above, right, these two rules have the exact same specificity. They're both classes. They have equal specificity. And that means the order is what determines which one is applied. Okay. So if we want our media query to override the non-media queried rule, it has to be below because it has the same specificity in this case. And for this reason, we typically just put our media queries at the bottom so we don't have to worry about this. Okay. Now it gets a little more complicated if you have multiple media queries, right? One for tablet, one for mobile. You have to make sure they're all in the right order. But in general, if we put them at the bottom, we'll probably be okay. Okay, any questions about media queries? So we talked about, how do you decide what width to put in these media queries? Well, it's kind of up to you to some degree. However, there are these sort of well-established breakpoints that we talked about. Breakpoints being, widths on your website where your layout fundamentally changes, right? So whether it be going from 2-column layout to stacked columns layout, or whether it be like the navigation being shown to being hidden into a hamburger, right? So those types of big fundamental changes typically happen at these breakpoints, right? And these are the ones we see most often. And the reason we see them most often is because they're popularized by Bootstrap, the CSS framework. And we have, mobile devices or any device that has a screen with less than 768 pixels. Tablets are going to be between 768 and 992. And then desktop is going to be anything larger than 992. However, in Bootstrap, they also differentiate between like this desktop, like a laptop, and like an iMac, right, with the really large screen. So we'll talk about that a little bit too. Yes?
If you're like, practicing kind of scaling, I think you showed us yesterday, like kind of scaling it down to see where it breaks. How do you know like at what point that is? Like what's telling you that's like 100?
That's a great question. So let's check it out. Let's inspect element here, right? So if I open my dev tools, see, first thing, this is not what I want it to be. Okay, there we go. So if I open my dev tools and I start changing the width, now it's not going to do it here. Let me find another site. Let's go on General Assembly site.
Amen.
Yeah. Oh, no. So there's a couple ways, but one way I might be able to do this is, find something that changed. Okay. And I can inspect this element. Okay. That was the hamburger. And I can look through its styles. And I may be able to find a media query in here. And so here we go. So that hamburger on media query screen and min width 900 pixels is displayed none. And so that's a breakpoint for this site. It's probably 900 pixels. There's also a way. Doesn't Chrome? This may be just because I have a new install of Chrome. But Paul, doesn't Chrome normally show when you have DevTools open the width of the screen up in the right-hand corner?
No, I actually have a plugin on Chrome. Chrome doesn't show the width. So.
Ah, interesting. Okay.
I used to write like what you call window.width in the console.
Oh.
I wanted to know.
Yeah, you could also do this. This will work too. You can click on the body, right? The body tag. And so, oops, I made that a little too big. I clicked on the body tag, and so it's highlighted the whole page, and I can see this is now 993. And now I can resize and just watch that width change. Oh, I should be able to.
Yeah, the plugin I have is nice because it lets you just type in pixel amount.
Yeah.
It's kind of weird that Chrome doesn't have it. I can look it up.
I swear my old Chrome did, but in any case.
It seems like something they would have.
Yeah, so you can check that body. You can get it to right at that point and go back and forth and say, oh, it's around here, and you can check the body and see how wide it is. There's lots of ways, but yeah. That's a good question. And if the site's using Bootstrap, these are almost definitely going to be the breakpoints. However, you can customize Bootstrap if you want and make whatever breakpoints you're interested in. So, okay, and then so we also talked about, if we're going to be doing responsive sites, it's a good idea to put this viewport meta tag, okay? And what this does is it basically standardizes when you have devices of different pixel density, okay? So, an iPhone, for instance, has a much denser pixel density than, some other device. And if you don't do this, then you're not going to get exactly what you expect when you're trying to target those devices. So that's just something we put up there. Now, the first two parts of this, width equals device width and initial scale equals 1, are pretty much, you're definitely going to use that. This last part, user scalable none, is you'll likely use it, but it's not required. This basically means the user can't pinch and zoom your site. So it'll feel more like a native application if this is none. It's going to feel more like a native application, less like a website if you don't allow users to pinch and zoom, right? Because it's going to be just a scrolling, no zooming on a mobile device. So that's up to you, but for the most part, you're probably going to use it. Okay. So, we know how to write CSS that is targeted to specific devices, specific device screen types, right? But what do we put in there, okay? So the first thing, the most obvious thing is changing the layout, right? So changing, if we have 3 side-by-side columns, that's not going to work great on a device this size, right? So we're probably going to stack those things instead. So changing the box widths or the column widths, as we might call them, when we're talking in grid, terminology, that's going to be probably one of the most obvious things we're going to do. It's just change the layout in some way to make it fit on a mobile screen. The second thing we might do is sort of look at our content and say, do we need all of this content to show up? And for instance, we don't want to necessarily show all of the navigational links at the top on a mobile device because that's a valuable real estate, right? That's what we call above the fold, what's visible when you first load the page. If half of that is taken up by navigational links, you've kind of shot yourself in the foot. And so often we'll just hide those things, and maybe we'll hide other things that aren't vital on a mobile device. in order to kind of free up some space. So that's the second thing you might want to look at. And then another thing you might want to look at is font sizes, right? So, large, if I'm on an iMac, I have these great big fonts and make it look really big and bold and beautiful, right? But if I'm down here on my small little iPhone, then, I may want this font sizes scaled down a bit. And so, yes, we could redefine every font size in pixels when we start writing our media queries. But as we saw, that's cumbersome, right? If we're going to define a font size in pixels on an H1 and an H2 and an H3 all the way through H6, right? And then on paragraphs and then on block quotes or whatever else we have different font sizes on, that's going to be a lot of typing, right? A lot of specifying font sizes. So the way we can solve that is by changing the units, right? So instead of using pixels, what we call an absolute measurement, right, is an exact size like inches, right? It's an absolute measurement. Instead of using pixels, we can use these units, EMs or REMs, in order to define relative size, relative font size. So relative to something, right, rather than being an absolute measurement. Yes?
I just have a question. Is percentage like a bad one to use for relative size for fonts?
So I don't even know that percentage has any meaning when sizing fonts. Because what is it a percentage of?
What happens if you define like the whole body as 16 pixels?
Right. So if you want to say a percentage of that, right, you use EMs or REMs, right? So because percentage, when we're talking about widths, right, or heights, is percentage of the parent element's width or height, right? And so it just doesn't have the same meaning in font sizes. So this is the way to communicate something similar for font sizes specifically. That's a good question, though. It's a great question. Okay, so here we go. So EMs and REMs. And remember, I said, what is EM? Where does that come from? Well, it actually comes from saying, the relative size of the letter M in the font, right? So it doesn't stand for something fancy or anything. That's just the letter M. So M or REM. So let's take a look at M's, right? And this is a font size that's relative to the parent element in the HTML DOM tree, right? So in this example here, I have a paragraph, hello world. Its parent element is the body, we can see here. And so if we define a EM font size on the paragraph, that means it's a font size relative to the body, right? Relative to the parent element here. And so since we've defined a pixel size, 16 pixel on the body, and we're saying that the font size of this paragraph is 1 EM, or 1 times the font size of the parent element, then the font size of the paragraph is also 16 pixels. Now if we change this to 0.5 EMs, right, that would be half the size of the parent, and that would be 8 pixels. We'd go the other way, make it 2 EMs, and that would be 32 pixels, because it's twice the size of the body. Okay. Now we talked about why this could be troublesome, and we looked at some examples of why we could run into problems or headaches if we're using EMs. And does anybody remember what that reason is? Anybody remember? You remember?
If it's nested elements, then you can change what the tag means.
Right, exactly. So when we use EMs, the font size is heavily dependent on where it falls in the HTML DOM tree. So we can have 2 paragraphs in different parts of the HTML that have different font sizes, even though they've been defined with the same EM size, because it has to do with where they are in the HTML DOM structure. Okay? And so this can be a headache because it requires us not only to do a lot of math, but it's sort of unpredictable, right? If we're moving around our HTML, all of a sudden things could change sizes, and it's not immediately obvious why that happened. And for that reason, this font size, REMs, were created. Okay, so this is actually a newer unit than EMs, is REMs. It has less browser support, but for the time being, it's supported by most of modern browsers. in any case, rims is not relative to the parent element. It's relative to the document's root, which is the HTML element. So the first element that you write on your page. Okay? So the reason that we like rims over ems, especially when it comes to this situation, is it's no longer dependent on where it is in the HTML. So we don't even have to see the HTML to know what font size something is going to be, because it's always relative to the HTML element and not where it lies in the DOM, not its parent. Okay, so another example, sort of a trivial example, but here we're saying that the paragraph is 1 rem, which is 1 relative to the HTML element. And so since the HTML element is 16 pixels, we know that this paragraph is always going to be 16 pixels, no matter where it is in the HTML. Okay? And we would not even need to see this anymore in order to know what size paragraphs are. Okay, so that's why it's nice. It's predictable. The math is much easier, and we love it. Okay, and so what that enables us to do, and I forgot a slide here, but what that enables us to do is when we're doing media queries, right, instead of changing the font size of every single element, like the H1, the H2, the H3, we can just change the font size of the HTML, and that will scale everything down, right? So we can change this from a base font size of 16 pixels down to, say, 14 pixels, and now everything that's font sized in rem, right? Everything that's font sized in rem will be scaled down along with it. And so that's much less typing and much easier responsiveness. Yes?
Do you suggest making your HTML font size the size of like your largest font on the page, or like the one that's most common, or
Yeah.
like this?
Yeah, totally. So that's a great question. The common practice is to make it the size of your normal paragraph text, right? So the text that's the most common on the page, make it that size, right? And then you'd scale your headings up. And then you'd maybe scale your small tags down, okay? But you want to make it sort of, right, like you said, the most common text on the page should be, what you've put in HTML. That's a great question. Any other questions?
That's just basically the HTML is just a style that we create or style sheet.
Well, what we're saying when we're saying the HTML, right? We're saying the HTML tag. Okay, so if we look at let me pull up some HTML here. If we're looking at an HTML document, right? We're talking about this tag, right? The root of the page, right? And that's what the R in rem is. It's the root of the tree, right? It's the very beginning of our document, okay? So when we style that, it's kind of trickling down to everybody else in some ways. Yes. And we don't usually put styles on the HTML. We could, but it wouldn't really do anything for the most part. In this case, it does because everybody is checking their font size relative to that guy. Okay, any more questions about font sizes? Or anything else we've talked about responsive stuff? All right, so what we're going to do now is complete the lab that we started at the very end of last class, which is taking the startup matchmaker exercise that we did a few classes ago and making it responsive. Okay, so just as a reminder, let's take a look at it. And if you weren't here last class, it's in last class's starter code. And so, I'll just go ahead and do this because this is a new computer and I probably don't have it yet. So if you weren't here last class, it was in the last class starter code. So go ahead and sync. And actually, everybody can do this because there is some new stuff. So let's go ahead and sync. Well, no, not download this again, but there's new starter code after the lab. So even if you got it last class, you can download the new starter code. Yeah, it's in responsive basics last class. And in there, just copy that starter code. So for those who weren't here last class, go into week 8, multiple screens, class 14, responsive basics, and go ahead and copy the starter code. And then I'm going to go into my named repository, we'll just go ahead and create class 14 because there's going to be new stuff for class 14, 15. So class 14, and paste that in there. And what we're looking at is the startup matchmaker. So I'm going to go ahead and drag that. Oh, new computer. I don't know how to drag on this thing. I seriously don't. There we go.
Did you say it was a new computer?
Yeah. Okay. All right, so let's take another look at this. All right, great. So we took a look at this, and what we did at the end of last class, we kind of scaled it down and just made a list of the requirements that we had in order to make this thing responsive. So the things we mentioned are, one, we're going to want to hide this and show a hamburger, right, which is that little icon that signifies a menu that we typically see on mobile. That we're going to add that and get rid of these on mobile. Okay, so that's one thing. The other thing we mentioned was we want to take this box and sort of make it full width so that it's more readable. And we want to take these 3 columns, which are right now side by side, and make them stacked. So one after the other rather than side by side. And then finally, we want to just scale down all the font sizes. Right, so they're a little big for a mobile device, so just scale them down a bit. And that's going to require, right now they're all defined in pixels, so that's going to require changing their definitions to a unit like rems, and then scaling them down that way in your media queries. Okay, so those 4 things, and if you weren't here last class and didn't follow us with the hamburger, then I'll come around and I can help you get started with that. Okay, so go ahead and get started. And I'll go ahead and write the requirements up again that we came up with.
Okay, and we had discussed that we could get that hamburger character as an HTML entity, so yeah, slides them on there.
So those are the things we want to do. All right, who was not here last class? Okay, so who was not here on last class and also did not get the hamburger? Okay.
I slacked out the entity code for it.
Okay, cool.
Since you gave it on Monday.
Yeah. Cool.
Not a spoiler.
So that, right, so do you really know what it is like the end for standard copy? So we go into that as like a copy. So this is a character. That is that 3 line.
What's mine? No, I
You know what I'm talking about? So it's kind of like that, but I got that first. They'll just
So it's like a menu.
yes. So but just a symbol, right? And that symbol is that's what I was to.
Why? But that's designed to take you to. It's an app.
Yeah, well, yes, it's like a, say we find that there's a menu. So we're not really making it work right now. We're just making it show up, and we're gonna hide those links. So, yeah, and developers and designers. So all those things. So they look great here, right? But here they're a little more. So we're gonna hide them and instead show a hamburger. Okay.
So that.
So do you have the slides? So one thing you want to add from the slides goes back to the page. Let's go down. So you'll need all this. Go down more. So this, you're going to add you can see this right out the front. So the reason we have that is because it makes it standardizes the devices and how they treat it. Some devices basically how dense the pixels are, treat with how. So this just kind of standardizes.
Yeah.
So it's something that we add to most folks.
Yeah. You can always download stuff from .com. So
And then for and will that ricochet?
So that's just gonna be writing new CSS inside of media queries. Okay, so you ready to get started? Sure, yeah.
Take a look, just go back and sort of go back to that entire.
How many to get started?
I don't know yet.
So do you understand, did you see
Yeah,
our
just something walk right.
Yeah, I know.
what that is? We're gonna get the
And it's sort of that balance between like this
It's just a special.
switching over.
So,
Because like if I was looking at it, why is that hammer away from the right? How is it line?
So we'll do that. One of the things we
So, yeah, just little things.
The body is 20 pixels,
Right.
font size, so it's starting.
okay, so this will review.
And then white's 10, or 10 pixels, so.
This guy. So you also want to
Yeah.
add comments.
Like, that's not really hard, that's not really hard, as much as I, it's like, it's yeah, that's like, it's just change. Change the line height if you want to.
Yeah.
This is the way it's standardized.
I'm not gonna go over that property, but that's where it doesn't like,
So this is what we should do. So generally we'll put that percent.
space, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll want to add that to the site as well. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Wait.
So,
And we got, you want to use like your little intro channel.
and that's where it'll do this, we're gonna do
Okay, yeah.
but
But
it's like not happening.
Okay, so let's check out the inspector.
Was that? Good so far. That's great.
no screw ups, that's good.
One thing you can do
That's
is if you're doing this street size, you might do this on this little three dot symbol. And you do this first. Yeah, so scroll up to.
So the issue there is that your media query doesn't like, if you set, so the thing is that it's gonna respond to whatever, like if you have like font
So what we're
size
really looking for is once created.
16 pixels and then you say like font size 50%, that's not gonna really go, because it's not 50% of your original value, it's still 50% of like the parent, right? Or 0.5. So
No, I think you have to.
you wanna look at where the font is initially being set, so you can look at, right, so it looks like they are kind of all, well, you have a body font size of 20. So what you could do is in the media query, set your body font size to something else, and then go from there. But you still would have to do this.
Oh, okay, so I'm saying,
Or I can
Or you-
memorize it.
Yeah.
because why is this over here?
Yeah.
So now I'm saying, back to where the other and say that.
Yeah, because for example, your H2 is font size 30, that doesn't really care that you set your body to,
Right. So it's rather than.
But.
yeah, I
This one is,
Still know what's right, it's just not, no, we don't have a toilet. It's
There's just a testing.
Yeah.
Because there's no magic for that sort of thing, because you kind of want to consider how everything looks individually, right? So it does sort of force you to kind of go through each one, which is valid, right? So, exactly, right?
And it has 10 of those.
Because CSS doesn't tell you like H2 is always 80% of H1, like it doesn't, so you have to do it yourself, yeah.
But there's gonna be some padding.
Okay, but it's really.
Yeah.
But I think that's where I feel like that.
Yeah, either one. Really.
You know what?
They got like, click on that.
Can't see the rest of your window.
Yeah.
Oh, it's just that entity code I gave you?
Yeah.
So basically you want to put that in some element that's hidden initially and then show it in your media. Yeah, display, whatever display box.
Oh, it's
Yeah.
have it displaying
Wait, so what the?
Exactly. Yeah, right. So it's, right, because there's two ways to sort of get elements on your page that aren't there initially. One is hide them initially, two is to hide them in JavaScript, right? This is just what hide it.
but this is
No,
it's not necessary. No,
it's
it's just not necessary, right? So like, usually by default, when you're using CSS, and you don't need JavaScript, you do CSS because it's a lot lighter on browsers. And also like, if you have a recipe, like, sort of 6. There are some browsers that like, some people that like can't use JavaScript, people who code things like script and, you have to sort of consider that if you really care about those sort of browsers. Okay, but I don't care.
These are good.
Like a no script tags. Your browser doesn't support JavaScript. Try again. Font size.
Yes, so basically, what I'm
Dot blur.
so what I'm
My favorite class thing.
So what I'm trying to figure out is like, how do you get this to constantly size? Because like, if I'm here, like it's always staying the same. Yeah. But like, so how do you? So when I was like looking at it, it looks like there's like a font that's a percentage, but it's always 100%.
Yeah, here's a hint. So I don't really know how GA does it, but if you ever see stuff changing in line, it's probably right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because CSS media queries will never put you don't notice
That makes
CSS
sense.
media queries never go in line. They'll just change on the right side.
Makes sense.
But JavaScript will stay in line. You can do. I have toyed around with using like view height and view width, which is like VWVH for font size, which will be responsive from screen size, but also like don't consider. First of all, I don't consider the fact that their font size constantly adjusts to be that cool and that useful. So like good for them, but yeah, it seems to be a bit much.
Well, it doesn't even like it's changing, but it's changing.
Well, what's changing? What is the H1
Change the size of it.
skill up? Oh, so that thing makes
Okay.
yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
No offense to GA, like BFD, whatever.
Right,
It's still, if it's in the same size, that thing still has room for it. They don't really care.
So,
whatever.
I was just trying to figure out how you're just.
Like,
I guess it's
whenever it says like inline stuff is getting adjusted, JavaScript. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
The CSS was, right,
So,
so the only thing I can think of to make it select is.
Oh, sorry, what's up? Yeah.
I
Absolutely.
just have to go to my CSS
Well, look
and
how, so it's really hard getting this.
Yeah, so really like, I was saying earlier, there's two ways to get, so on your page load, there's, so, what do I want to say? After your page loads, there's two ways to get, stuff added to your page, right? There's, hidden initially items that you then show with CSS, and there's like, adding elements to your DOM with JavaScript. In this case, we're just using CSS. So yeah, you're just putting a hidden element, and then your media query, you're changing its display property, right?
Okay,
Or its display value, sorry.
so technically I'm sending this or no?
No, you wouldn't delete. So you'd have basically, so your initial view, right? Just think about this like practically. Your initial view, so you have two things in your document, right? You have this nav menu that's visible initially, so that's display whatever it is. You have this hamburger item that's display none. Then when your browser shrinks, you're going to display none the LIs and show the hamburgers, right? So switch back to display whatever you need, right?
Okay, so I'll add
So like initially, right, you've got that hamburger as display none, right? Because on your initial page load, right? Or see, not your initial page load, I'm phrasing that incorrectly.
More likely.
Your initial size, if it's greater than 768, will be hidden, right? Because it's not the page loads and it's smaller. You shouldn't. I'm phrasing that incorrectly, but yeah. So your ID number, right, should be display none, unless the screen is smaller than 768, so it'll be lower on your CSS display, right? Make sense? Right.
I just realized it's there are two parts of the side, so we need to add margin to
So what did I use?
Okay, so we'd say you had margin for error. I'm kidding, it's terrible. My dev jokes are strong. I'm in the back of the class thinking of dev jokes all day.
Very cool. Okay, so
she actually
In the media query, yeah. So right there, display none. Right. And then scroll down in your CSS file. Do you have your media query or something?
Yeah.
Okay. So make your media query for that, and then within that, and what that'll do, you always want to make sure that's below your style index, not screen dependent or screen size dependent, because if you ever have that below your media query, it'll just override whatever's in your media query. So it's be like less than 768, do this, and then it'll just say, well, in all cases, do this. But really, what you want is all cases do this. Then if 768 do this, right? Because you want anything that, otherwise it just gets overridden because of the way CSS works. So within, so right now, I would assume we are, right? It's like with 33% width or something. So we think we need to set the width to, in that view, we're getting the set right? And note that you can keep the float if you want. In this case, you can set float, you need to set float to none, or just leave it as is. If you float something 100%, or if it's 100%, it'll just stack, right? Because
So.
the only sort of advantage there if you have the float is that you don't need.
Well, no,
to
even if it's displayed on, we should still see it in the HTML. So, what is this? I don't know if this is the issue, but that circle is like that. It means it's unsafe.
I want to see it. Let's get it. Now.
So about the font size.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what.
How can we? It's the.
Oh, you're saying it's like not important content on mobile?
Yeah.
I mean, that would, I think philosophically, that's like why you would hide that, right?
So should there would staff to just put.
I think originally we were just gonna have the meager match stretch out to the full width of that, below 768.
Is that not what?
The way we
I mean, the pictures
is
is
that
there.
all of the font sizes up here, that's so small.
What
And
did
then
you do to the,
we make the
what did you do to like the font?
on the top section.
And why, wait, hold on. No, I mean, it's good. Why are the font sizes so small? They're like way too small. Picture if that was on your phone. That would be like this, big.
I don't know, I just made up.
What?
What size do you
You
think?
didn't memorize it before you looked at it?
So not 2.5. Can't read it.
Jacob?
Yeah.
Should I go to 3.6?
I got everything. However,
Okay.
I guess
so
bigger.
I know that it was here, but you wanna just
That
change the between here, like,
between 1 and 2.5.
Yeah, like 0.875 maybe. Again, I mean,
Yeah, so,
that sort of
yes.
thing, like font is always, it's
Um,
one of those things that doesn't have any.
what you might be tempted
Right,
to
where
do
it's like,
is in your hamburger,
that's okay, with
change the
100%.
pattern there.
So,
Okay.
I wouldn't get too
Now,
hard.
And actually,
Really,
really
when
work
you're,
because
when you're actually
hamburger
building that sort of
is
thing,
not
really,
a
like, when you guys see the font size,
Okay,
like,
so,
there's no like,
you could just use that.
right,
So
but it
let's,
seems like there's a better one.
well, there may be, what I was going to say is like, if it was a map, right, this page header ID is gonna be more specific than the hamburger.
Yeah,
So it would be
don't-
the hamburger rule because it was a class, even if it's a final.
you know, make sure you just understand.
So that's what I was going to say, but then I realized the hamburger we just made like it did.
Because, yeah, there's no like,
So it's not
there's no like,
it's not-
it's all
So let's take a look
inside.
in the inspector and see like where it's in.
It's not with 100%, but like, that's it.
I think we should probably do like, I
There's
just
no other
think
answer.
it's smaller.
Okay.
Go.
So you see this thing here? So this thing tells you like, there's its height, this is the content height, there's the padding, there's the border. So notice it has no padding, it has no border, and no margin. So it's all the height. So okay, so it's just the height of the font that's causing that to happen.
But hers is.
So it could be a lot of things. So it could be using a different font size. It could be
Eighth grade, you should always see.
at all. So let's just look at, oh, you got some margin.
But I did add
And that's all, and that closes. Then you need to, so we see like 2.5.
And go like,
I can know that.
so eventually it's
You know, I think since it was the end of the file, it didn't have any effect.
at some point there's a font size. To find, yes, and it's probably 60 pixels, right? The 20 pixels.
But.
So it's 20 pixels.
Why is it crossed out?
Because it's being overridden by another. Okay. So the other rule happens to be US. It's still affected by it, but it's like, this is the one that's. So you could do a couple things. You could.
Yeah. And then your actual.
So
those
the
are.
font size is, yeah, that's pretty big.
Right.
If you like that, you can keep it, and you can try another CSS property convert.
Okay.
You can try that. Now we try it in the browser. It's gonna be hard to experience. So right, just click in there.
You see what the issue is?
Now just like down arrow can go down list. You have to go back, it has to be empty. So just erase this. And now just hit the down arrow.
That's where the console is going super helpful, right? Oh, there we go. Looks great.
It might, doesn't appear to be.
That's sort of like,
So that
The
way,
console is like, the console not
you
locked.
could try using
That's
right?
So,
Physical,
I
I
mean,
mean,
is it, if the console not locked, you can't access.
I'll just hit this.
Console locked, like, JavaScript, let's do it, like that. And that thing, that's
So instead of doing this, try to find it in like your party apps or something. The line.
Right, that means that.
So like,
So what that's telling you is how tall should I make each line of text?
Yeah, I don't know.
And so like now we're squeezing the text size down.
but it doesn't actually squeeze the font.
No, it doesn't. So if you have multiple lines of text, it's
Okay.
Okay. But since it's only one character, right?
I don't like
Okay.
this, that's,
Okay, cool.
the other thing you could do, this is probably better, so I think you might do is use negative margin top. Kind of hit the drag. It's a little bit less nice.
Okay.
Negative ones.
Yeah, negative margin is just.
People have.
And so there are some
I have font
font
size,
sizes
I
like
found
15.
final solution, guys.
So like
We're all set.
Oh, so remember how randoms work. I'm not even sure what negative numbers mean. But what it is basically it's a percentage, right? So what we're doing is
okay, so the body like so I based it off of this body actually. And then I just
So the next step would probably be to
that's
turn
like
that
change
into apps.
Yeah.
So like
Drop
so
down.
the equation we're trying to
So
solve is this.
that's super easy.
oh I guess it would just be
We're gonna talk about it later. Probably not that
15.
part.
it would be 40.
Yeah,
you have this, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. 50 is equal to x randoms
Right.
times the HTML font size.
Correct.
So you have to solve for x. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, no problem. Any other questions? If you are
Oh, you should say you
nearing
want.
completion or
So like when I did this, I watched.
then
So you want
stretch
that-
goal here is
want
try
that
to make that
to
number
be
not
position,
Yeah, but that's where you click on it.
yeah, when you click on it,
so that's gonna have a
it
fixed
shows
width,
the
and then
links.
the rest of it.
Click on it again,
So once
and
you
it
have, like a wrapper.
So if you
have
finish
this
everything else,
fixed width, and this just takes up the rest.
Okay.
So I'm going to do, you
Okay.
go to, oh, it stays the same.
Like when I go down here, the thing is the same right here.
Okay, you're on the right track.
That's what you're talking about?
Position six. Oh, no, that's, yeah.
Yes, so first of all,
So, like,
this
is- yeah, you're
starting to
No, not every, that's like stuff is overlay.
So let's see. Remember, that's just
But in
text.
this case, if you're saying that,
So
Okay,
so that's the actual.
I'll do my, okay, so just add that.
Well, so this is where this startup match with the text goes, right? It's in between the two tabs.
I just need to position.
I'm not sure if you have the text that you want to show.
Yeah, you just put it up.
Get rid of float.
Now, go ahead, please. Right, so the other thing here, you apply the style of display none to that computer div, but you put all of your other navs inside of that div. So since it's inside of that div, it's also going to get that display none. Which is not exactly what we want.
Oh my God.
So what we should maybe do is just change wherever it goes in.
Yeah.
So probably want meeting groups, what we can also do is,
So now all that's in that little hamburger
maybe
div
exact
is
code
just
for
that
that
little.
version, but I know there's exact code for those, but what you can do is to say, as my screen size gets smaller, the left side has a fixed width up to a certain point. And then the right side takes up.
So this is pretty good. I mean,
If you don't wanna say for
to
example,
translate this to what
says
this
because it gets
is.
smaller, but instead there are straight points where it's that fixed width.
Right, and then like when it gets down to like
And
there,
this way you
like
can say like,
hamburger, like it has to
and
be
it's just still that way, then it's.
It's exactly what it is. Okay?
It has to be loose. Yes. Because it would be hard to with the 3 by 2 one, right?
So, small
right now I have this.
small syntax thing. Media query is open and also has to be closed. So
So I
wherever
wanted to.
your style is in for your media query, another
So you can, so you may not want to use that initially. You can also
So wherever the style is, so this hamburger is definitely part of this media.
basically,
So we need to put this first
like
thing
you have a current after the whole loop, all your divs is one by one. And then you set.
Oh, yeah, so then this also needs.
Outside.
They have to match.
Set,
Yeah.
So that would work. Yeah, we have one of the things I call.
This
So
would be.
typically we do these.
Yeah.
So you can see that. And then we have to close the media query. So this one is closing this hamburger roll. Exactly. And this one is finishing the media query. Yeah. And so we could actually put in one rules here, and they would all be part of that media query. Okay. So this is good. Now, one thing the possible values of display don't
It
include.
looks a little weird in the.
The thing we put there is the actual text that we want inside of this. So display means, is it showing, is it inline, is it up,
And he's,
yeah, so the way we would decide, right, is what is a div?
so I think you're referencing like sometimes you go on like our, I understand you said the
So this is a block.
bar at the top, like where you scroll down, you can look that up. You can also, just, and that's actually what you would with the
This
DNS,
is,
to make sure that
you just,
you say, so this should always go over that.
so,
There, that's
let's click on it, and see what, so let's click
Now.
on it.
that's what you can slow down all that.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's what I'm doing. We've got our element here, you see no styles specific to it. So that tells me something is wrong with that CSS editor, because it's not going to apply.
I sent you that
Take
thing.
a look at the CSS. Okay, so what does that select mean?
Alright, it's just also slacking.
Yeah.
So,
Not what's inside, just the green part, where's the selected?
How is that close on my.
So what is the dot?
You have the desktop on it
It's a class.
Oh, because this is.
for Slack?
Yeah, so ID.
An ID, so it means.
Oh, okay, I mean, I use it at work with this class, with my friends.
And so you have that.
For sure, I'm sure you're Slack is in chat, so.
Ooh.
It's hipper chat.
It probably is. We use link because I have in here. No, actually, we will check who comes.
I love that Lincoln spells L-I-N-C, it's maybe my favorite Microsoft spelling.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, that works like, see there, great work,
Actually,
let's call it a day.
this. When we get to that.
For I guess you wanted to say, like, you're pushing the work, yeah.
It's pretty amazing.
Or do you wanna, or do you wanna come back together? Okay.
Yeah.
Um,
And I actually did require.
What are you?
So you wanna
Require. Yes, that would make sense.
Oh, you're good? Okay. Feel free to take a break. Okay. I think we're just doing a free form break, so
Yes.
don't ask for one later, this is your break.
Oh, the hamburger's gonna do this. So, first of all, hide those things, and then see where it is. And then maybe. So, real quick, everybody, feel free to take a break whenever you want, because this lab is gonna go for a while. If you've completed these things, if you've completed these requirements on the board, what I'd like you to do is try to make that hamburger work. Okay, so we've added the hamburger. We have some JavaScript tools. We know how to listen for when things are clicked, right? We know how to show and hide things when things are clicked. So as a stretch goal, try to make that hamburger work. But feel free to take a break whenever you like, and come back to it.
Yeah, they made fun of yours. It's like, Nick Cole's like, we went to Georgetown, so shout out to all the Max Bros. I have no idea they looked at it.
Okay.
Basically just.
I think it's one of the
No, that's fine. Okay, so, alright, so which task are we on? Hamburger probably?
Yes.
So.
Too much. Good friendship. All those kids. I watched anything they made except for Mulaney, because that was there.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's not how we want to do it, because we want to do it all CSS.
Okay.
When we're making responsive sites, we want to not change HTML at all. We want to let CSS in. So how do we hide something in CSS? Close. Explain that. So what we want to do is just add a CSS style.
Yeah,
That's all we have to tell you.
Yes.
No. We're just still working on this / taking a break.
So this is saying,
But if you're like, if you're quote unquote better, you're not taking a break, and you're laying ahead. Because I don't know if that term is used outside of the class.
Okay, cool. So what we want to do is, when we get down to a mobile screen design,
Then this class doesn't have,
we want it
what
to
is it?
show.
What's the word you're waiting for?
So, what's the CSS for show and then for the show display?
Yeah, but it's just also, like, not GPA also good, but like erase
So we want-
yes.
So the possible values of display.
Yes.
Block,
Working.
inline block, or not.
Yeah.
Whichever one is the
Yes. Confidence, yes, or like maybe yes. So like that. Oh, what's that about?
Block 4, you have to basically just rewrite this.
Oh, I see.
so we're trying to get,
And you can, write it.
You're running deep into freaking code pens now.
yeah,
I love it.
um,
do it.
okay, yeah. So we copy and paste
Okay,
it,
yes, just a small syntax.
Sweet.
Your
which is
user
basically,
itself
which
is
we
not
put
the
into
text.
our,
What do you
But-
think?
with this, you definitely need.
What is it, like,
So href equals hashtag, that's like, that means they're like dead buttons that don't actually open pages.
Well, I mean, like, don't you need it to be,
So it doesn't have a maximum.
because like, when we click our,
It has a maximum.
our hamburger,
I
it's
would
two things, right?
Oh,
yeah.
So
what's-
this, the less there equal to is gonna hurt.
It's like, wouldn't this need to be?
Can you go back to that flip pen?
That's the-
Can you slide over?
Alright, so go ahead.
Can you, can you toggle the CSS width?
Cool.
Thing?
So the next step here is to hide these.
Okay. And I can put as many of these selectors inside this.
Exactly, yeah. So
Okay.
that's good. We need to- Oh, okay, well, that's fine, so, yeah.
So the explicit.
No, you gotta keep it, you're giving back that.
Oh, yeah, no, you just need that class open menu, close menu. Okay, yeah. Yes, you need, I thought you were referring to the ones up top, because they have
Oh, no,
classes.
No, I just,
Yeah.
you need it.
You need an anchor tag, yes, sorry, my fault, I misunderstood.
No, yeah, I probably was.
No, I'll take responsibility.
I'll take it. So we need a
So we got all.
Not yet, now I'm trying to figure out how to make the process.
Oh,
Yes.
Okay.
Also,
So I'll wait until close.
So. Yeah. So then I can, you can choose that, potentially that. This is that code is not gonna grow.
Classes, you have different structure, it's like, you know, the first thing you're gonna do, right, is bring in jQuery into your project, and you're gonna use that, then you create a JavaScript file, you create a JS directory, you can JS folder, so that kind of stuff. And then after that, really all you need to do is, you know, you can use this as a guide, but really all you need to do is, when that user is clicked, you want to show those lists. Just as simple as that.
Need a copy.
This is doing what this do all of this. Well, it may or may not be confusing, but it's just not going to be exactly. It's not going to be exactly working. It's going to have anything class moving. We don't have the class scanner. So you know, it could work with like some modification, but it may be better to try to build it ourselves. Okay. So, the comments. First of all, you can control the slash.
But I want it to not expand this whole section, just to drop down on this.
Okay. So you're trying to use position. So I would encourage you to read the difference between fixed and absolute position. Okay. Because what you're probably doing is this absolute position.
Because I tried absolutely well, and it did read better.
Okay, yes. So that's not the one. The other problems are have to give it, when you use absolute fixed position, how do you get some coordinates, positions? So we haven't talked about position. Right. But absolute position means this. Position it absolutely in my elements at these coordinates. Right. So you give it CSS property.
So, but if you're resizing, how does that work? Because it's not always gonna be, you know, because I always want it to be 5
Then specify those things.
Okay,
And not the others. Because if you don't specify the others, it'll be automatic. Whatever. You could try fix. The difference between fixed and absolute is that fixed is fixed within the entire browser, no matter where you scroll.
Okay,
Whereas
so now,
absolute is fixed within
your web, that's what I want. So,
Yeah. Do you want to see it with JavaScript or with CSS? You're probably going to use JavaScript for this. Okay, because what we're doing is we're waiting for that thing to be clicked. And when it is, we're re-displaying those things. Now you could potentially do it with just CSS. Yeah. You know how much you might do that?
Yes.
Yeah, well, it may not have to be that complex.
Well, you basically create a hidden map that's not, that's like, you know, like But-
Ordered list.
Yeah. And then you could just basically say that, you could do it like on the hover.
I mean, that's the only way you could do.
Yeah, because you can't really click.
Because click is like an event.
Right,
It's
that's
hover
true.
is like a state that no one has.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So you could hover, you could say like, you know, when my parents hovered over me, I could have a selector that has that hover on my parent and then my elements. Then I would say when my parents hovered over display.
Right, yeah.
So you could do it with just CSS, but you know, I encourage you to try to write JavaScript because we haven't talked about JavaScript in 2 days. It's good.
Yeah.
And it's keep your memory fresh.
If you want to do it that fancy. But. Unless there's a way somehow you can really shape it. Because it's already this way, maybe you just want to say this style. Maybe you would-
All right, in a few minutes, I'm going to go ahead and do the hamburger thing up here. And we can all see like how we might make that thing work for real together. So I'm going to give you a couple more minutes just to kind of finish up these requirements to the best of your abilities.
So instead of, so instead of three different divs, like sugar free, like divs, but I just use it like one big div.
Yes, and that rapid div takes
You got it to work.
three column properties, the three different column properties from browser.
So you
There's
just
like
put it
widget
in.
columns, osmosis.
Yeah, no, totally. It's awesome. So yeah, so start on these next few goals. Next one is you have to make this that
Then there's
box there kind of take up
Column breaks for it,
squeeze
or
that
maybe so
inside.
that you don't split up.
You can stay in the image like that, on the image. You can stay, you know, where it is. It's not to be a little bit wide. So it's like, that's no, that's true.
Good shot. I mean, is it working? So your first issue is that hidden list your selector. You see how what type of that selector is that? Is that element selector? Class, right? But is it written? Still need to call your specific here. Yeah. Second thing is that you need to put a comment between this land block because you're passing it. Negative. So you need quotes around hamburger.
Yeah, so, so I'm still just trying to type this in CSS. Just
Okay,
because-
yeah, why not?
So I have that there. But it's hidden.
Okay.
And you're close to
Remove from the console log within the show this function.
So this selector, right, as it stands, is selecting the hamburger
Running on
when it's
that
up.
menu. Right. So let's just make sure the function. Now I'm getting.
So what you want to do though is not select the hamburger itself. You want to select some child when the hamburger is being updated. So scroll, look at your HTML. Okay.
So this is what's hidden. That's
Okay, so if you actually take this out, put this inside of this. So there's no way to select something that's like up into the left.
okay.
So
So it just needs to be inside the hamburger. So
yeah, so try putting it there. And so that thing is hidden by default, right?
yeah,
It's gone. Well, let's get down to the screen size really soon. Just to be sure. Okay, cool. It's still gone. Now what we want is not the hamburger. So we want to leave that because that's the condition that we flip. What we really flip is the OL.
okay.
So we're going to use a nested selector. Right. So what this is literally saying is
When the
Select.
hamburger is hovering, select.
select an OL that is a child of a hamburger element that's being hovered over.
Okay.
Okay.
And we just say display.
What's an OL? So
Spoiler
inside-
alert.
Yeah.
Totally. Okay. So right click that. Oh, yeah, just inspect that. Okay, so open this up. Okay, here's something you can do, okay? Right click on that hamburger, on the hamburger element itself. Now, you can force it to be hovered over. Yeah. So now, click on the OL. Okay, so it's not, okay, check this out. So look what's happening here. Remember, this is showing in the order of specificity.
Oh, it's an ID.
Yeah.
So
So what can you do?
make that nice.
Yeah, I mean, you could just make it more similar to this. So that OL is inside of the hamburger. Inside of the page header, but it's also inside of the
Okay, so
Oh, you can do that.
does that work?
Yeah, that'll work. Yeah,
Oh. Yeah.
so we didn't actually say that. So here,
Well, but what would you suggest?
so what I would suggest is changing the other rule that is the OL to use the
Yeah, and just theories,
just because.
but
Yeah, oh, right.
So here, instead
Yeah.
of using that, we use the
so it's
so you have to position it and stuff, but
Right.
essentially this is.
it's organic.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, for my client galleries.
This is yours, yes.
Just wanted, no, you can still use it, I just wanted to make sure that it's still there.
Yeah, no, I mean, no, I have my own if you want to take it.
No, you can, I'll be here for a moment, sorry.
Are you sure? Okay, all right. Okay, so let's go through this hamburger thing together, okay? This is a little miniature JavaScript review within a week about CSS, okay? Just to keep it fresh on the mind. So, first of all, let's take a look at what we have. Okay? So, we've got this, right? It shows these links when we're at a desktop width. And when we get down to, you know, sort of a mobile width, it's going to hide those links and instead show this hamburger element, okay? And we achieve that by doing something along these lines, all right? I'm going to have to make this font bigger. Everybody see that? So, you know, by default, oh man, that is going to really annoy me. Yes, I am aware. It's a new computer. Okay, by default, right, on a desktop view, by default, we want to make sure that hamburger is not showing, right? So when we have the links there on a desktop, we've got plenty of real estate, no need to show the hamburger. So we're going to use display none to hide it, right? So that display none is the CSS way of taking it off the page. The HTML is still there, and if we look at our inspect element, we'll still see the HTML for it there. It just won't show up on our page anymore. It just takes it out of the visible page. Okay, so that's how we hide something using CSS. I also gave it this margin top because without it, it was kind of close to the top, and I wanted to sort of space it out a little bit. Now, it's not being displayed here, but we can still put the styles in there if we want, because you know those things will still apply later on. And so then in a media query, I use display block, which is sort of the inverse of display none. And the reason for that is because a div is by default a block element, right? So we want to return it to its default behavior, which is to this display block. Okay, so that's what we're doing here, is we're showing it again. And in fact, when you use jQuery hide and jQuery show, it's doing this. It's using display none or display block to hide and show it using CSS. Okay? And then at the same time as I show that hamburger item, I want to hide the links themselves. And so I will use this nav ul selector to just hide that list of links on a mobile device, so within my media query. So this is how I would set up that. Okay, so now we've got this, but what we want to do now is when that hamburger is clicked, we want to show those links again, okay? And so we're going to have to use some JavaScript to do that, because that's, you know, this is sort of the paradigm we've been using all along. Wait for something to be clicked or some event to happen, and when that event happens, we're going to perform some action, modify some CSS, in this case, show those elements again. Okay, so let's do that. And we have a little bit of setting up to do. The first thing we've got to do is, we'll notice this page doesn't have any jQuery yet, so we're going to have to add some jQuery to it. And, you know, I usually do that by just Googling jQuery or going to a previous project, copying it from there. I'm going to go to this download jQuery link. And somewhere down here, there's the CDN section. And I'm just going to take this script tag from the CDN section, the top one here. How'd they change this? This used to have the just the // and they just changed it to have that HTTPS. I like that. So now we don't have to modify it all. We can just drop it in there. And you know, once we do that, we're going to have to create sort of a file structure for our JS file. So I'm going to have to create that JS folder, go up here, new folder, call it JS. And then within that JS folder, I can right-click, new file, create a JS file. And I'm going to save that thing as just index.js. And once I do that, I'm going to have to add another script tag to my page that has my index.js JavaScript file. I do that using this relative path. So I go inside the JS folder to get that index.js file. And now this is at the bottom of my screen, and that's no good. Pull this up. There we go. Okay, so just a little refresher. I haven't done that in a while. I would say this either. All right, so now we've got our index.js file. And the first thing we always do in this file, remember, is sort of add that boilerplate code, which is to make sure our document is ready for some script to start running. And we do that by finding the document, right, listening for its ready event. And when that ready event happens, we run a function. And that function is our program. Okay, and so then all of our program code is going to go in here. What's the first thing we want to do in this program? The first thing we've been doing in pretty much every job, all the JavaScript we've written so far. Yeah. Spot on, right? We want to register an event listener, create an event listener, and what event are we listening for? Right, we're listening for a click event, and we're listening for that click event on the hamburger element, right? So that's sort of the full line that we're going to write is we're going to find that hamburger element, we're going to listen for its click event, and when its click event happens, we're going to run some function, right? We're going to respond in some way. So let's go ahead and do that. Actually, it's probably just saying register click listener. So I'm going to use jQuery to find that hamburger element. And in my case, I use the class on it called hamburger. So I'm just going to use that as my CSS selector here to find it. Oops, that's not how you spell hamburger. Humbug. Jeez. I can't type. Okay. So now that we've found that hamburger element, right, we want to wait for that thing to be clicked. And when it's clicked, we want to do something. And I'm just going to call this thing toggle menu. And why do I use the word toggle? Why should I use that word? Looks like you're going to give me an answer.
That's
Yeah.
So it'll go, if it's open, it'll close. If it's closed,
Right, toggle is this word that means kind of make it the opposite of what it is. So if it's showing, make it hidden. If it's hidden, make it showing. And that's kind of the behavior we expect when we click this thing, right? If we click it and it's hidden, we expect it to be shown. If we click it again, we expect it to hide itself again. And so that's why I'm going to name it this. So what's the next step here? We've attached this event list here, but what do we need to do now? Yeah, we need to define that function because we haven't given it any meaning yet. And the way we do that is we create a function with the name toggle menu. And in this function, we're going to do something, right? Well, what do we want to do, just in layman's term, in English? What do we want to do in here? Right, so we want to show the menu. Well, we'll assume the hamburger stays visible, right? Because we want to be able to click it again to close it, right? So we'll leave the hamburger visible. What we want to do is show that menu or hide it if it's already showing, okay? So how do we find that list of links? What selector should we use? So here I'm going to create my jQuery thing so we can find those things. But which selector should I use? Well, I'm just going to reference back my style sheet and see what selector I used to hide it. So here I use this navul selector to hide that list of things, right? So I selected all the ULs that are in nav elements, and I applied the CSS display none to them. So I'm just going to use that same selector. So I'm just copy it, and I'll put it right here in my jQuery. Okay? So remember, the things that go in this first part of your jQuery is just any CSS selector. And so we're just going to use the same one that we used to hide it. And we talked about there's some jQuery functions like show. We could just use that in order to show this thing. We could also do something like, CSS display block. But for this purpose, I'm just going to use show because that's a little more intent revealing. Okay, let's take a look at this. So we've created this little thing. I'm going to now open this in the browser. It's going to open over here, of course. All right, so here we are. Here's our thing. And let's see what happens when we click it. Boom, shows up. Okay, yes, the layout's a little strange, but we've got the general idea, right? We've got the links showing when we click that menu. So what do we expect to happen when we click it again? We'd expect it to hide itself again, right? But when we click this, we'll notice nothing happens. And why is that? Exactly. Every time we clicked it, it's going to just keep trying to show it. It's already visible, it's going to just stay visible every time we click it. So what we want to do here is not show, but toggle. Okay, and it just so happens there's a jQuery function called toggle that does exactly what we're looking for. It hides it if it's visible, and it makes it shown if it's hidden. Right? So it kind of toggles its visibility. And so if we use this instead, we should be able to refresh here. Click it, showing. Click it again, hidden. Showing, hidden. Right? And that was as simple as, 9 lines of JavaScript. Any questions on this? Now, yes, again, if we're making this our production site, we're going to have to spend a little more time with the CSS to make sure when it shows again that everything is laid out nicely, which we haven't done yet. But this is the basic building blocks, right? We now know how to kind of make that thing visible when it's clicked and hide it when it's clicked again. Any questions?
The script part of the HTML, so I see that you have 2 lines of script, so you got those 2 lines from online?
The first line here is jQuery, right? So the first thing we need to do is make sure jQuery is available. The second line is what? Yeah, well, but take a look at what is the source here? What's that? Yeah, exactly. So the source here of this script is my JavaScript file, right? So this first one is pulling in jQuery. The second one is pulling in my JavaScript, okay? And remember the order there is important because my JavaScript uses jQuery, so jQuery needs to be before my JavaScript. Was there another question? I thought I saw another hand. Did you have a question? Okay. But
I do have another.
okay, cool.
So why are you using toggle and not modifying the HTML to show, to display or not display the navigation?
Yeah, so why am I using toggle? Convenience. What does toggle do? It modifies the inline style to show or hide it. So it's
just less.
It's just, this is like what we might call a convenience function, right? It takes, rather than having to do all of that work myself, jQuery has kind of done some of it for me. But it's under the hood, it's doing exactly that. It's modifying the HTML to give it some inline styles. We could also use like slide toggle here, right? And that would give us a little animation instead. Well, let's actually take a look at that. So we can use the slide toggle function that we learned about in one of the first assignments. And then we can come back here. And now, oh, that's kind of cool. Said cool anyway. See, we got that nice little animation. So that's starting to look like something. Yeah.
I feel like if you were not doing the slides with just the clip, I feel like my first instinct was to make a smaller menu.
Yeah.
Instead and have that show the not have the big one showing and change the CSS, which would that be?
So how would we do that?
Why just make like a small thing and hit it in CSS and then like.
So yes, we could add more. We could add just a different HTML, right? We could add another list in our HTML and use that one instead of the old list.
But if we were gonna do the old list and change the CSS, when it's clicked, would we do that? Would that be another JavaScript function that's like change the CSS?
We could do it that way potentially. We could also just define the new styles in the media query. So I could just change the styles here in the media query. When I toggle it, it's only overriding this one thing. So anything else I put in there will be the same. So so if I put in, say, a smaller font size here within the media query, that font size would only apply when I'm on a mobile device, right, or on a device with this maximum width. But out of the box, it's not going to be showing anyway. And then as soon as I show it, it's going to get that style. I mean, it's going to have that style anyway.
Okay.
You see what I'm saying? So I could say, make my font size 0.5 REM, say. And, oops, when I refresh this, so now you can see the font size is smaller, right? But when I go back to full screen size, oh, I've really done it now. Oh, well, that's because so when I go back to full screen size, you'll notice the font size is still the same because we're not within that media query. Cool. Any other questions? Okay. All right. So we have, let's go ahead and get into the next set of material. And then before we go into the next exercise, we'll take our next break. So what we're going to talk about now, CSS frameworks. Okay. So what are they? Which ones are popular? Which ones are used? How do we use them? What does that mean? All these things will be answered. So what are CSS frameworks? Well, at the core, a CSS framework is just a style sheet, really. Okay, and that style sheet has a bunch of things defined on it. In particular, it's probably going to have a bunch of classes defined. Okay, so it's just bringing in a style sheet with all of these classes that have been defined on that style sheet. So once I start using them in my HTML, those things take effect. But they're just, when I pull in the framework, that's all it is, really. It's just a style sheet. Okay, and those styles might be for defining layout. They may be for defining, certain types of forms or buttons. They may help us with how we format images. They may help us with, whatever it may be on our page. And most of these things have an extensive list of features that we could potentially use. And they all do that by just defining styles in a style sheet that we have the option of using. Okay? So what are some frameworks? I've mentioned this a couple times, but Bootstrap is far and away the most popular CSS framework. It was released just after media queries became part of the CSS standard, 1 month after that happened, in fact, by a group of developers who worked at Twitter. It was called Twitter, I'm blanking, Twitter something else, and then it became Twitter Bootstrap, and now it's just Bootstrap. It's kind of separated from Twitter altogether. And so that, that's by far the most popular. This is probably in order of popularity. The next popular one is called Foundation. Has very similar features. All of these are going to have comparable features, just implemented maybe in a slightly different way. I've worked in a lot of different web projects, and 90% of them, if not more, that I've worked in have used Bootstrap in one way or another. And so, that's why I've included it as the one we're going to look at. So what does Bootstrap provide specifically? Well, it provides a bunch of things. The thing we're going to look at today is this grid system, okay? And this grid system is for creating responsive layouts. So not just layouts, but responsive layouts, layouts that adjust to screen size, in a way that is both good and also very easy for us as developers to implement. Okay, so that's what we're going to focus on. And this is probably like the most heavily used feature of this framework. But it also gives you other things. It can define like typography styles, so like how big are your font sizes, what fonts do you use, things of that nature. How do things in code tags look? How do block quotes look? Things of that nature. It defines all of those things optionally if you want it to. It can give you all kinds of utility classes to make your forms look cool. And so, rather than having just sort of a bland looking form, you can just put a few Bootstrap classes on it, and all of a sudden you've got this amazing looking form. Similar with tables, images, icons, you can just use these classes that Bootstrap provides and just all of a sudden have these awesome looking tables and icons and everything. And actually, I want to just show you sort of a few of these things and kind of demonstrate what I'm looking at. But if I just look up Bootstrap, I'll get the documentation website. Don't worry about going here yourself, but we will later. So for instance, let's take a look at like images, okay? So here we can see some examples of things you can do using Bootstrap classes. So all you need to do is have in your image tag, add one of these predefined Bootstrap classes, and all of a sudden you have your images that are formatted like this. So you can have these nice rounded corners on your images by using this img rounded class. You can have a circular image by just using this img circle class. And then you can have this cool little border on the outside using this img thumbnail class, right? So this is the idea of some of the stuff that a CSS framework will give you. It gives you all these sort of prepackaged, nice looking styles by just putting classes on your HTML. You don't have to write a line of CSS yourself. Okay, so that's kind of the draw of a CSS framework. All right, so let's talk about the grid because that's really, what we're going to get into today. And like I said, this is a way of defining and a way of thinking about responsive layout. And so, occasionally I've alluded to, thinking in a grid when we talk about layouts. But this is going to make it explicit. So the semantics that Bootstrap use is as if our layout was a grid. Okay, and that grid has rows and columns. So let's look at the parts of the grid. Dun, 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 dun. So the first thing that's part of a grid is a container. And in most of our projects that we've worked on, we've defined a container class ourselves, right? And the container in Bootstrap does basically the exact same thing. So on a big desktop screen, it's going to squeeze and center the content. When you get down to a mobile screen, it's going to take up the full width, right? Because we want it to take advantage of all the screen real estate on a mobile device. But on a big iMac, we kind of want it squeezed and centered, right? And that's all the container class does. We've seen it before, right? You restrict its width maybe to a maximum width of say 1,000 pixels, whatever it might be, and then you give it margin auto, so it will allocate the margin on either side and center itself, right? And that's basically what a container does in Bootstrap. All right, the next part of a grid system is a row. Okay, and a row is basically a group of boxes that you want to be laid out next to each other. Okay, so if we're thinking back to when we were writing all of our own CSS to do this sort of thing, the row would be the thing that you put the clearfix class on, right? So when we are working on layouts, we draw a box around the things side by side and we clear fix it. Well, when we're using Bootstrap, we're just going to use this row class. And this is better, right? Because it's more semantic. This class gives us a better idea of what we're trying to do with this div, rather than just putting clear fix on it. That's sort of like hard to follow, especially if you're not familiar with what clear fix is all about. And I will tell you that there are a lot of developers who learn Bootstrap first and have no idea how the underlying clear fixing works. So you're a notch above them now. You can kind of, So like I said, this row is a group of horizontally laid out columns, and that brings us to the next part of the grid, which is the columns. And the columns are where the actual content goes, right? So if we have a layout with 2 columns, a 2-column layout, inside of those columns we're going to put the actual text or the images or whatever content is actually on the page. Okay, and here is what the column classes look like. Okay, so in this case, this is saying column, C-O-L, MD is medium, and that last part of the class is a number. Okay, and so what this means is this is a column. This middle part is a screen size, and this last part is how many columns of our grid is this going to span out of a total of 12 columns. Okay, so in Bootstrap and in pretty much every grid framework, we're going to use a column system with 12 columns. And I think I mentioned the reason for this, but does anybody remember the reason we like 12 columns? Yeah. I thought you raised your hand.
Yeah.
Matt? Yeah, go for it. Oh, sorry, go for it, Matt. You raised your hand.
Oh, it's because you can divide it evenly or oddly. It can be an even number or an odd number.
Right, so 12 divides evenly in half. So we can have 2 columns. It divides evenly in thirds. We can have 3 columns, 4, 4, 4. It divides evenly in fourths, 3, 3, 3, etc. So that's why 12 is good, because it's one of the only smaller numbers that divides nicely into half, fourth, and thirds, which is probably the most common situations that we have, right? And so what this is saying, so that's what the 12 columns mean. Let's talk about the middle one, right? So this middle one is a screen size. In this case, we're specifying a medium screen size, okay? In Bootstrap, medium means desktop, okay? There's large, which is like iMac size desktop. There's medium, which is like laptop size desktop. There's small, which is tablet. and there's extra small, which is like a smartphone. Okay, so those are the potential sizes you can have here. So what this full class means is on a medium-sized device, be 6 out of 12 columns wide. In other words, these 2 columns are taking up half of the total row, because each one is 6 out of 12. I'm going to show you some charts to sort of illustrate this, but this is what it means. And now, also what's in this meaning is if it's a screen that's bigger than medium, also be 6 columns wide. So any size screen, medium or larger, be this number of columns wide. Anything smaller than this size, and it's going to stack and go the full width. Okay? So in this scenario, when we go down to a small size, a tablet size, these 2 things will be stacked automatically.
What's the, how do you say the extra small? Maybe you do SM?
SM, XS, LG for large. Yeah, exactly. And I'll show some examples. All right. So once again, this class means a column that spans 6 out of 12 columns on medium devices or larger, and full width on anything smaller than medium. Okay, so anything that has this class is going to take up half of the row on a laptop, on a big desktop. On a tablet, it's going to take up full width, and on a phone, it's going to take up full width. Right? Anything smaller, yes.
So if you were trying to, can you do like a row that's only like half of the screen or half of the size of the screen, and then you do 12 within that? Or
Yes, so I didn't include this in the slides, but you can have rows inside of rows, inside of rows, inside of, if you want, right? And each row is going to have a 12-column grid, right? So, yes.
how does it know which 6 it's taking up?
The order in which they're in the HTML, right? So this one is, it's going to be left to right, right? So this one's going to be on the left, and this one's going to be on the right.
You can also you can also switch the layout in Bootstrap. Go like left to right, and then on a small screen go first, second
Yeah.
first.
This grid system is very sophisticated, and there's all kinds of other classes you can use in order to kind of change this default behavior. But if we're just using these classes, the way we look at it is this one's going to be on the left 6, this one's going to be on the right 6. It's just going to read, left to right like a book does. And when they stack, this one's going to be on top, and this one's going to be on bottom. Okay? So if this isn't making sense to you yet, it's okay, because I have some illustrations. But before we get to those, can anybody help me out by telling me, what does this one mean? What does this class here mean? I've given you the formula. You're looking at me like you know. Yeah.
Oh, okay, it takes up 10 columns on something that's small or bigger,
Mm-hmm.
and if it's extra small, then it's
Exactly. This class means this is a column that's going to take up 10 out of 12 columns. It's going to span 10 out of 12 of our total columns on small devices or larger. And anything smaller than small, which is only extra small in this case, is going to take up full width. It's going to stack. Okay. Now, one more thing you can do, and then we'll get to the illustrations, I promise. One more thing you can do is you can actually add multiples of these classes. Okay? So this is how we read this. On a medium device, this is going to take up 3 out of 12 columns. So on a medium device or larger, it'll take up 3 out of 12 columns. On a small device, it's going to take up 6 out of 12 columns. Okay, so if we're on our desktop, these things will all 4 be next to each other. When we get to a tablet, there's going to be 2 and 2. Okay, everybody with me there? So on a medium device or a large device, right, because anything bigger or 2, they're going to be 3 columns wide, so they're all 4 going to be next to each other. The total is going to be 12. They're all going to be next to each other. As soon as we get down to small, well, this class is going to take over.
It's going to say each one takes up half of the row. So now on a tablet, they're going to be 2 and 2. This all happens automatically. We don't write a single line of CSS. That all happens for us. All right, so let's look at some illustrations to hopefully make this make sense. All right, so let's start here, okay? This gray box here is our browser, all right? This is a browser we're going to assume is on a desktop device, so a device that's larger than 992 pixels. And I often say desktop to mean both laptops and anything bigger, because most people are on laptops these days, and so desktop is a category unto itself. So here we are. Our gray box is the browser, and it's a browser on a desktop device. Here is our container, right? And like we said, the container is to kind of squeeze and center that content, especially on desktop devices, okay? So this white box here is the container, and that's kind of squeezed and centered the content of our page, okay? Now I'm just using this dot here to show that that's a class that we put on this element, all right? So the next thing we're going to put inside of that is a row, okay? So we're going to put a row inside of our container. And we remember that row has 12 columns. Okay, so when we put a row into our HTML, we think about that row as having 12 columns. Okay? And inside of there, we're going to put our individual columns. So here, we're using column medium 6, which is saying on medium devices or larger, be 6 out of the 12 columns wide. So each one is taking up half, right? 6 is half of 12. Each one is taking up half of the row. Any questions about this? Okay, so we could adjust those numbers to kind of change the layout. Maybe we wanted like the main content in a sidebar, right? We might do something like this. We might make the left one 8 columns wide and the right one 4. And now we've got sort of like main content in a sidebar kind of layout going on, rather than 2 sort of equal things. And you know, maybe this isn't the only thing on our page. Maybe we need another layout. And you know, we can add just another row below that row. And this row has maybe 3 things that are of equal size, and each of those would then be, you know, 4 wide. Okay? All right, so let's come back. What? Oh, sorry. Thought I saw. Let's come back to this. Okay, so here we are, desktop browser. We've got this one taking up, you know, on medium devices, which a desktop is, 8 columns, and this right one taking up 4. So if this browser shrinks to tablet size below 992 pixels, all of a sudden these 2 things are going to stack. Okay, because we specified only the medium screen size, so anything smaller than medium, they're going to stack. Everybody cool with this? Okay. And so let's look at this other example where we had 2 classes specified. So here we are on the tablet. The tablet, remember, is a small device, and so these 2 things now are half and half, because on small devices we said be 6 columns. So these, when we add this class to it, down on tablet are going to be 6 columns wide. If we go back up to desktop, they're going to be, again, 8 and 4, like we had a second ago. If we go down to smartphone, once again, those things will stack. So down to extra small, now those things will stack. Because we've said small or greater be 6 columns wide, medium or greater be 4 wide, but we haven't said anything about extra small, and that means it's going to be full width and it's going to stack. Any questions about this?
So now we have these super sophisticated layouts, right, without writing any CSS. And that is pretty awesome. You can see why people use this, right? No floating, no thinking about clear fixes. And it's important to know those things because that's what this is using under the hood. It's using all of those things that we learned. In fact, with the knowledge that we have, we could probably write this Bootstrap framework grid system. But we don't need to, right? It's been done for us. All the quirks that happen in different browsers have been worked out. And so we're just going to use this. Okay. If there's no questions, then we'll go ahead and start using it. Yes, question?
Simple question. When we go on any website and use the dev tools and we see like the classic like CSS there, does that mean that they developed it in that CSS or maybe they use this and it's just...
Yeah, any CSS that's being applied will show up in the dev tools. So we don't know if they wrote it. We don't know if they're using a framework. You know, we don't know if JavaScript added it. You know, it could be any of those things, and it will show up in the developer tools. Because the developer tools is going to show us everything that's being applied. So potentially, you know, when we look at developer tools, it tells us what file is applying that style. So we could maybe, if the file is called bootstrap.css, we have a good idea that that's coming from Bootstrap and not something that they wrote on their own. Does that make sense?
Like in the CSS, so all the ones that we looked at, they happen to have like clear fixes and stuff. So that means their CSS wasn't Bootstrap, but like...
No, not necessarily, because Bootstrap, remember, is using clear fixes and all of these things underneath the hood. So it's, and they probably don't call the class clear fix itself, but you know, they have some similar implementation that they're using in order to do this stuff. Because that's really the only way there is to do it, the way we learned.
So it's retranslating everything in Bootstrap to like CSS that we see in the...
Yeah, well, we may or may not be seeing Bootstrap CSS, you know, in those dev tools. Does that answer it? Okay, cool. All right, so actually, yes, that's a great point Paul just made. Instead of going in right into the exercise, it's a little bit after 8:30. So let's go ahead and take a break, and we'll come back, and we'll do a code along together, practice using Bootstrap, and then we'll take it back to the Startup Matchmaker exercise that we were working on and use it there. Yeah. So we added, so the first line you have here is that's changed. The second line should be your JavaScript file. So I wouldn't give it as a whole source, I would just change the source. So the source is what file to load.
But
So
so I have a lot of friends who use that.
So JS is the folder. No. You have to tell us the folder and
Yeah,
it's like all relative. And so the way we show files, it's like folders based.
it's also measures.
Oh, that's so nice.
Right, so small is considered.
Right, and read that as.
Seems like just things medium.
So it's like the high school.
That's cool.
Hey, it works.
Right.
Yeah, I mean,
So on this line,
What files on it?
Probably upgraders.
and here,
What's
run tablet.
It's like.
Cool. Yeah, no problem.
Jacob?
Yeah. Appreciate,
Yeah, I sure did.
But it makes sense.
Suspect. What do they have on it?
How good they make it.
Good.
Wow.
So.
Oh, and that's what.
Yeah, that's what.
Yeah. They like unite it.
It's like a kind of bottle.
Well, because John Deere was very like.
They're never great.
Generation.
Instead of family.
John Deere lost their business.
We wanted to buy it anyway. You can't do it.
So they said, I'm voting for
Yeah, that sounds. Makes that news to everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I got.
And you're close, you're mistaken on line 12.
There's one view, but they say, they say,
Right, a class is not part of the program. So CSS takes
I actually.
property, yeah, property and value, but class is not a property.
No, it is. It should be in the.
I know.
Yeah.
Pissed.
Yeah, you see that's a great message.
Yeah. I lose my voice so fast. It's never gonna work.
All right, let's get back to it.
Yeah, then you just have to do
All right, so where we left off, we've learned all about Bootstrap, or at least about the grid system. So the next step is going to be, we need to add that to our project in order for it to work, right? Just like we need to add jQuery to our project in order to use jQuery, we need to add the Bootstrap CSS in order to take advantage of it, okay? So what we're gonna do, first of all, if you haven't gotten the starter code, let's go ahead and get the starter code for today. So we should have synced already. And then go ahead and open FEWD22, and then in class 15, there's also a starter code folder. So copy the class 15 starter code. And then I'm going to go into my named repository, create a class 15 folder, and just paste in that new starter code. And in here, there's this Bootstrap boxes. So let's go ahead and drag the Bootstrap boxes. Golly, I don't know why I can't click and drag. Into Sublime Text. All right, and so what we're going to do is basically, do what we did last class, but instead of using our own homegrown media queries, we're just going to use Bootstrap to kind of do the same thing for us. Okay, so here's what the layout looks like on desktop. We've got this header with these 4 nav items here. We've got some sort of like maybe featured image or something. These 4 sections here, and then in the bottom we have 3 sections there. All right, so and then on mobile we want it to look like this, where everything's stacked. Okay, and these things are hidden. All right, so you'll notice our HTML is empty. We've got a few things here in our CSS, but not much. The only thing I really added was to give some things a border so we could see them. So what we need to do is we need to actually add Bootstrap to this project in order to use it, okay? And the way we're going to do that, I'm going to go back to the slides here, is I'm just going to go to the Bootstrap library website, and I'll post this in Slack, but it's called getbootstrap.com. And I'm going to go to the Getting Started section. If you scroll down here, one of the first things we see is the Bootstrap CDN links. Okay, so just like we use a CDN script tag to get jQuery, we can do the same thing for Bootstrap. Now let me explain. There's a few things here. This is the base Bootstrap CSS. Okay, so the grid system is in this one. A few other things are in this CSS file. This one is what Bootstrap calls a theme. And this is like stuff like colors, fonts, things of that nature are themes, right? And so we don't actually need that one today. I mean, if you want to add it, by all means, but we're not actually going to use that one today. And then this one down here, Bootstrap also comes with some JavaScript, like UI component things. And that's sort of like more advanced Bootstrap, but you can look at the documentation and use those things. And this is the Bootstrap's JavaScript file. We're not going to use that either. So today, all we need is this top one. So I'm just going to take this top link, right, which is how we load style sheets. And notice, at the end of this cop, there's a bootstrap.css file. It's just a style sheet. And I'm going to take that link and I'm going to put it in my project. In the head, right, which is where we put CSS. Okay. Now we're good to go. Typically, whenever I pull in an external style sheet, right, a style sheet that's not my own, I'm going to put it above my style sheet. And that's so that the external style sheet doesn't override anything that I write. Right? I want my stuff to be the most important. Yes?
Excuse me. Is for, like, if you have multiple external style sheets, like if you have like Google fonts style sheet and all that, what order, like Bootstrap fonts?
Yeah, I mean, it depends, honestly. It depends on which thing you care about more, right? So if it's a font, right, if a font has a very low chance of colliding with anything else, because you're not going to be defining fonts in multiple external style sheets, hopefully. Whichever one you want to be used, you have to move to the bottom of that list if you are defining it in more things. So it depends, right? Whichever one, if you add a new external style sheet and all of a sudden it overrode a bunch of things that you were using from the other external style sheets, you might have to change the order a bit. Okay. But in general, you're not going to have many external style sheets other than maybe Bootstrap and a font, or maybe what other framework you're using. Yeah, no problem. Okay, cool. So we've added the Bootstrap style sheet. And remember, this base style sheet includes the grid, so we're all good to go. So the first thing we're going to do is just write our HTML. And, we did this the other day. I'll take another peek at the layout here, but it looks like we have a header with some links in it. So that's what I'll do first. So I'm going to create a header element. And inside of that header, I'm going to put a nav. And in that nav, I'm just going to make these links for now, because I don't really care about it too much. But I don't know. You don't have to put text in these if you don't want. I'm just doing it so we can see what's there. Okay? So we've got our header with our 4 links. The next thing we've got going on is just this big box here, right? So we don't really even need Bootstrap for this guy. It's just a block element taking up its full width. We know how that works. So we can just add it here. And I'll make it just a div. So I don't actually know what's going in there. All right. Below that, we have 4 things next to each other. And in Bootstrap terminology, what might we call these 4 things next to each other? A row. So let's create a div here. And generally, when you're making, a row, or even sometimes a column, you'll use a div, right? Because it doesn't have too much other semantic meaning. Now, if you can find some other semantic meaning for it, use that. But in this case, a div is probably what we want. And to make it a Bootstrap row, we're just going to add the row class. Okay? Inside that row, we know that there's 4 things next to each other, or 4 columns, we might call them. And so what class might we put on these things, right? So our formula is col dash screen size dash number out of 12. So for one of these, what class might I use? So we want it to look like this on desktop, and on tablet or anything smaller, we want it to look different. We want it to stack. Yes, right, exactly. We would do column, col, medium, which means desktop or greater, and 3, because these are each taking up 1/4. 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3 is 12, a full row. Okay? And so I'll just make these like articles, let's say. Who knows? They could be anything. And like we said, we're going to give each of these articles a class of col, medium, 3. And I'm just going to put some text in there so we can see what's going on. I'm going to have it say article 1. And then I'm just going to put that in there 4 times, because there's 4 of them. And I'll just change these. 2, 3, 4. Okay, so now I've got 4 columns, each one taking up 3 out of 12 of my total grid. All right. Cool. So let's switch back. And then finally, well, we got just another row. Instead of 4, this time there are 3 things. So it's going to be a very similar exercise. So we'll create underneath this row another row. And for this one, I'll use section. Why not? Have 3 sections. And what class should these sections have? What class should these sections have? So we know that the ones before were column, medium, 3, and each one of those are taking up a 4, right, out of 12. So what class should we put on the columns that are taking up a third each? 4, right. We're going to put 4 because 4 is a third of 12, right? And we want each one to take up a third of the grid. And so we'll put here column, medium, 4. And I'm just going to put section 1 and then copy this. One, 2, and 3. And so now each of these things are going to take up 4 out of 12 on medium screen sizes or larger. And on a small screen size or an extra small screen size, anything smaller than medium, They're going to stack. Okay? Yes, question.
If we wanted to offset something, would we just have like an empty section that takes up the same amount?
You could do that. There are also bootstrap classes for offsetting. So there's like, I don't remember the exact class off the top of my head, but something like column, medium, 3, offset 2 or something. And you can do things like that. So you have to look it up because I don't remember the exact syntax. But yes, there are just classes you can use to offset. Any more questions? All right. And actually, yeah, okay, we'll just leave it. I was gonna say we could change this to make this a footer, but you know, we've already done it, so. All right, so we're missing one thing. Does anybody remember the one thing we're missing here?
Container.
Yeah, we don't have a container. So, you know, it might still work, but our content is gonna be like however wide the browser is, even on giant screens, which is not exactly what we want. And so we just need to wrap all of our content in a container. So I'm just gonna highlight everything inside my body. And I'm just going to hit tab to indent it one level, just to keep it nicely formatted. And up here, as the first thing in the body, I'm going to add a div with the class container. And then, since I opened it, I have to close it right down here before the body closes.
Why don't you just do the class on the bottom?
Well, you could, but why might you not want to do that? For instance, this site is going to have a white background. Okay, but what if my site wants to have like a gray background? Okay, if I make the body a container, the gray background is going to be squeezed and centered. It's not going to take up the entire page. So generally, we don't want to modify the width of the body, because we might want to style the body. So we usually put a container inside of it. And we can also, instead of having one container for everything, we can have multiple containers down the page, potentially, instead. There's just different ways of doing
I
this.
was gonna say, if you wanted like a section to have a background, but across the page, you want to use just a container for that.
Exactly.
And then that way you could.
Right. So if you want to have different backgrounds that take up the full width of the page, you might need to use multiple containers. But here, we're not too worried about that, so we're just going to use one container. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Okay. Well, we can kind of see the skeleton of what's happening here, right? The interesting part are these things. And so here we have a row of 4 columns and another row of 3 columns. And we haven't written a line of CSS. Oh, see that? This is a large screen size here. This is a medium screen size. They're keeping their proportion, but they are snapping a little bit. And then as soon as we get down to tablet, everything's stacked. And it's going to stay that way all the way down. And we did all of this without writing any media queries, without writing any floats and clears and all that stuff. Just added some classes. Pretty sweet. All right, so what I want you to do now is kind of take this newfound wealth of knowledge and go back to the Startup Matchmaker and see if you can use this to do the layout, specifically for those bottom 3 things that were side by side, and then you stack them. So instead of using your own CSS to do that, try to use Bootstrap to stack those things. Yeah.
I should have added this one here before. So, let me I think I know the problem. Don't take
So maybe I could. So all of the screen size parts of POM are always gonna be 2 lanes.
Oh,
So
this
these-
part here,
Yes,
is NG.
it's ND, yes. So large is LG, medium is ND, small is
And
SM,
then,
extra small is XS.
okay. Because I've had issues on other responsive websites, like Squarespace websites, I always think I'm on the small size.
Hmm.
Even though it is, because
It has to, probably has to do with your screen resolution, these are very,
it's a very high resolution display, yeah.
so that's probably.
So like, always just like, on certain Squarespace things, it always shows me. That's really weird.
Well, so the meta tag that we talked about
Uh-huh.
is designed to combat that.
Oh.
So if we add that, so maybe those themes aren't using that meta tag, or they're using a slightly variation of it, that's
Yeah.
absolutely. That's
Just
just
kind of right as it is. Yeah, it works, good.
cool.
I just like. I just all I did was add
So in order to use this in our startup matchmaker, we're gonna have to add that link tag. Start a matchmaker.
all I did was just add each round.
And then add those classes. We'll also have to remove our media query classes.
No, that's fine. She's, well, she's got main as the bottom one. That's for ACS.
Right, right.
So that's fine.
Yes,
Why
maybe.
do you expect it? Take a look.
Yeah. and this- so
You're
like-
mostly referring to the fact that it's sort of like not filling up
The base,
exact third, right?
instructions
I haven't
stuff.
done anything, all I did was just
The
paste it
font
in there,
sausage.
and I just was
What
curious
you
as
do
to
when you
why
go
it
and
was
say, I don't want you to style any of my other stuff.
What?
I agree.
This is the things that you've previously styled, right? Yeah. This is
Right,
like,
well, I guess what I'm saying is that any classes
But
or
what-
anything.
I mean, I'm asking you what-
Extra.
what changed? You're telling me you placed this in if something did.
Yeah, so this is all shifted over here.
Yeah, so expect, I mean, I would expect to figure out,
You know, you're defining a lot of your own stuff.
so you can,
Background images.
we'll scroll down, you're not sort of on the right thing, but.
I just wanted to start by that.
Yeah, I guess the base file does that.
So Bootstrap applies those sort of stylings. Yeah, Bootstrap has a whole bunch of stuff for like
Probably not the size.
every tag. So that's what I. You pretty much.
So we basically overrode my.
Desktop size.
It's not necessarily overrode because your own CSS file is getting loaded last, but if it's declarations that you didn't have, like if you didn't have margin top, now it's gonna use Bootstrap margin top, because that's the only margin top declaration it sees.
What's typeless? Is that Bootstrap? So Bootstrap, even though it's above mine.
That will change.
Yeah, it still has element tag stuff. Yeah, I mean, you can take a look at what it's at. Yeah, that's the thing with Bootstrap is it does have a lot of default stylings that you may not want. So you sort of need to know like what it's doing and kind of work with each little piece to make sure you're getting what you want.
These are already open classes, so or you can put a div around each, around these three.
No.
To make it, can I just add,
Exactly,
like right here?
exactly, yeah, because it'll just read that from the Bootstrap file being loaded.
So it'll all be in this, or like, is that gonna work or not?
Yeah, it's what, a third, right?
I
Yeah,
have a question.
exactly, 4 out of 12.
It's not more.
But, yeah, but I mean,
But you would probably get rid of tout in this case unless tout is doing something else for you besides doing the grid.
well, it looks like, I mean, that's just.
Is there a point in using like four lines and?
So I don't need any line.
Yeah, you can just get rid of
Bootstrap uses normal.
Oh, it's already built in.
the tout class in your HTML.
Okay.
Or what you can do is get rid of the parts of tout that you don't need anymore because
Yeah,
Bootstrap
so
is getting
anytime
those,
you
which
bring
would be
in
like
files,
float left, the width,
Anytime you bring in extra
I think
CSS
padding,
or JavaScript.
the columns have padding on their own.
So, but maybe it's just better just to get.
Up to you, yeah, I mean, you can kind of see what it does, you can.
So it impacts your load time, but
Okay.
it's not gonna be as hugely significant. And so there's a cost benefit analysis, right?
Yeah.
Is the cost that we'll spend in development time, for our own.
I mean, you can see in your CSS what it's got, so you're probably be getting into the dark shadow. Maybe that back.
Okay.
How's it going?
I got to work, but I don't like
Because we
that.
have
Like,
thousands of developers. So again. we
Yeah,
should
it's
just add
really
that
jumping over, it's like really jammed in there.
One guy working on the website.
Yeah, you may want to take a look at just where it's interesting.
You also
Because
can further
really
really
have padding on there.
create custom versions of
It's
Bootstrap,
all
we have the pieces we need. And that will
states.
further
Maybe it's
send out
because,
size.
oh, you know what it is? It's probably what, I won't say it definitely is this, that way if I'm wrong.
Exactly.
It's because you only have col and B,
Totally do that.
Yeah.
so that padding is getting applied at a certain point, and it's got no padding, below that break point.
If you use the
So if
same
I add
header
it,
in Bootstrap,
That's, but it's, I mean, you still have to top.
so I kept Tal versus styling,
What can happen
Just
is your
your
browser
browser
will do something
page on it. and
Exactly.
So your browser will keep it.
The original one,
And then if you go to another website, it's using the same system.
Okay.
Right now.
Browser.
No, that applies to both, that's 3%, right?
Yeah, so, yeah, that's an advantage.
Yeah, take a look at that because basically you have it, so it looks like you have tau giving you some padding,
Yeah,
and then
but with the.
column would not give you padding because that class won't apply. I don't think,
I just.
I don't think, but, just take a look, just inspect it and see where your padding is, and maybe see that you need to add something, yeah.
Is there a way to make that distance so it works?
What works?
It's nice.
What do you mean, sorry?
So I'm saying, so that as far as the function of stacking, right?
What? Yeah.
So I'm asking, is there a way, like, when you, so how do you make this?
You would just add a media query for text line center for that text, yeah, for that class. Yeah, that's not really referring to stacking, or stacking is just the fact that it takes up 100% width, so that's just different sort of, properties.
I mean, you're dealing with.
Basically,
This is what said it,
coming over each functionality.
Is
All
there-
the functionality is coming with some
Okay. Okay.
So, yeah, as soon as I take
Yeah,
that.
we can totally do that. It happens all the time.
So some.
Yeah, just be sure if you're confused with something, obviously come around, but also inspect, you can kind of see, look read padding, the red margin, you can see how everything's saying.
Okay.
I'm trying to figure it out, so like I put in. Bootstrap and I heard about my CSS.
Yeah, you, express it, that's what I did. No, you don't, space.
And then all of a sudden.
Commas are used in CSS for, defining multiples, like, for, signing classes.
So let's talk through this. Why did that happen?
Spaces for the.
Well, I know Bootstrap was fighting, so Bootstrap was above my CSS, so was my CSS thinking that was the parent.
So what I think is happening,
Go for it.
was since it was below, fonts, it was
Yeah, bro.
fonts, but there's probably something in Bootstrap that like overlaps those. Basically sets a style for it, and then it was loading that second, so it was like highlighting the fonts.
Exactly. Exactly. So Bootstrap has, and I thought that was in the theme files, but I guess I was wrong. There's some font stuff in there, some just basic font stuff in there.
Okay.
But it's over, the order doesn't matter, right? Because it has the same specificity. And therefore, because most of the time that I find font on the bottom, right? So it's always going to be the same specificity.
Right
So then the order of the style should actually happen. And the last one is going to be.
Right.
So in this case, you still put it after the font, it's going to just.
Because what's
Yeah,
happening is.
and a lot of times you don't have to do this.
Bootstrap is
Order to figure out where it's at. Right.
So when
Not
we
necessarily you can just get into CSS, or you can rely on Bootstrap now for the.
how to edit.
Oh,
would keep that class in.
Because
If
like
you wanted to add additional stuff
to it, then you want to put these strategies like once you recess, we get started this day. And then we would.
Yeah. So yeah,
So that was saying,
so you can still use media
that
queries,
your
It's a style and you know what breakpoints Bootstrap is using,
Right.
so you can just make a media query that has the same breakpoint, which happens to be the one
So
that
if
you
you
already have.
sort of like, if you put that
You can
media
style
query in
other
the file,
things that
and then you
aren't
go to the
related to the
universal
layout.
declaration below
Got
that.
it.
So you no longer want to change like widths and flows and those types of things.
Okay.
Bootstrap's limited, but any other sort of aesthetic changes, you can do in a media query yourself.
Got it.
So there's no ban on media queries if you're using Bootstrap. It just allows you to not worry about the layout and stuff.
Got it. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
What are you hearing on so far?
So what's happening there?
I have my media turned from a pocket query, so it's not allowing it.
It looks like, right?
So what I'm looking at here, I think what I
There's
think is
definitely
happening is
that-
there's something causing these things to be a bit
Also
bigger
big sort of-
than a third. Or,
Or different
There's
than the
some
rest of
adding-
it. It's got kind of this
okay, so those are, that's why I
like
guess.
kind of destination almost of like how it's laid out. Yeah.
So you would involve some things that we haven't talked about yet, specifically the offset, right? So if you imagine that this is a grid of 12, right, we might want to make this like a column
Exactly,
of
basically
4,
takes a string in.
but we want it
like the-
offset by
So go
12.
back to your JavaScript,
And so
so when you take
it would
that in,
involve some
dot
classes that
val,
we
just
haven't
add
talked about, so you might have to
to
Google
dot to, so
bootstrap offset.
basically saying, so get this value and then make it all of this. And it's,
I have a question.
right,
Yeah,
exactly, right, when you, and then, oh no, sorry, so not put that in, because that would be assigning
that,
value, and
so
then you just
let's
actually
say
change it on.
yeah.
You need to count this.
To the head, where you're doing statutes. Okay.
So now anything that the user types in will be stored full lowercase, and then you just match it up against all lowercase, yeah.
So I guess what's happening is in the main one, since that's you have it
Not sure, this is
given
another one for.
style to the URL.
But it's still.
Because it wasn't showing before, and as soon as I,
Yeah, that is.
Yeah, they're all uneven. I feel like
So
it's-
let's just, right, so we can see what's going on.
Yeah, try this way, line block. For those divs.
This should only be 768.
So go up to the LI.
No, so keep that, just put the columns, those are the columns, right?
No, those were being
See what-
columns.
So is that for the, what are the divs that are each dimension? Oh, that's, okay.
That was just actually stuff.
Well, isn't background the wrapper?
So there's no, let's start.
No, so what is
Oh,
the
the exact
actual div, like, of the picture?
So-
Yes, you got display.
Here's the-
You've got, you already got display. You just need to change it.
yeah, it wasn't there.
So just put both in line as well.
No,
If
in
you
line,
can
I
use
should block.
Bootstrap, it's overriding. This is just like.
You gotta learn it,
Stop.
Yeah, the only thing I changed was just something like that.
Oh, so what did that do?
I can't remember exactly, because it's been a while since I looked at
Yeah, I'm
it,
not
but
sure,
that,
but yeah.
basically,
You can see that it's
I don't think that
Yeah,
goes.
that's style. Cool. Just style.
Yeah, okay.
This is.
It's up. It's pretty good. Nope, you can actually put, the or, operator here, which is, yeah, and then you still need to put city equals, because it has to read out the full condition, but you can just do it all within one parenthesis. So that's fine. Strawberry is good.
Got
Yep.
a second.
Something that, I mean, you got the columns in there.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just referring more to the started manager exercise.
There's some pages.
Okay.
You know, I was referring to like changing the start salary.
Oh, yeah, I think there's.
And I'm trying
So you're trying to add the padding to the tails?
Just the two column.
Thank
Do
you.
you want to take a look at
Okay, so
it? Next office hours.
there's much more here, right? Is like kind of create some space inside the boxes.
Right.
In order to get them off the walls. So really padding would be, yeah. So let's try that and then see why it's actually. Okay. So, what we see here, first of all, notice that's not showing all.
Yeah.
So, first of all, let's try to make the screens a little bit smaller. So, I don't think that's. Okay. So, interesting. Okay. So, take a look at this one here. And what do you notice about that? So that's not very far, right?
So it looks like your section here.
Sort of seems actually
that
near.
So right now you've got this section.
That's what I
The
see.
full, so I see no adjustment for section. So that's
Really?
why you look at here, the section, right, and you may even call that main, because really like structural symmetry, like you've got a main section, main element and a side, right? So if you look here, you've got this section, that should be the thing that has part of it. And then the remainder should be like the sign.
Yeah, so I think that is 700.
See where you may.
What was making.
So let's go back to your. You've got, so you see you've got clear fits and then the two direct child elements. Section, right, which should be. So just basically work with that. Just work with it.
All right. I want to demonstrate something I saw some people doing that is a common issue that we see when we're using Bootstrap in the last few minutes here. So one thing that was mentioned was, do we need to use like normalize when we use Bootstrap in addition to Bootstrap? The answer is no, because Bootstrap includes normalize as part of the library. So as part of the Bootstrap framework, it's using the same normalize that we were as part of itself, because it needs that base sort of foundation to work off of. So you don't need both. In this project, if it has a reset, and if you remove that, you're going to see some things change. And that might take some working through. But for this purpose, all right. So here's where we are. Okay, and we've got. Oops, this is the wrong Sublime window. And the way we did this was by giving this section, this tout section, a row class, right? That class, that section there is the row in our layout. And that row, we drew kind of around these three things, right? Okay, all good there. Flip back to Sublime. And then each individual tout, right, as it's called, was a column that on medium devices or larger takes up a third, 4 out of 12 of the grid. And we can add that class to each one of those things in order to make that work. And as part of that, we have to go through and remove the float and width from our style sheet, because Bootstrap is going to take care of that stuff for us. So we got to get rid of the floats and widths on the touts. Okay? So we can see here we are, and that part works just fine. So here we are on a tablet device size, and they're stacked. We get out to desktop, and they pop into place. Okay, all good. But what do we notice that's changed here? Oh, the other thing that we did is we added a container, because Bootstrap likes the container. So I just put a container around all the content. But what happened, and this is not so desirable, these backgrounds have kind of moved, squeezed, and centered. And really, we want those backgrounds to go all the way around. So instead of putting the container there, I'm just going to move the container just around the row in question. So down here, and I could just add another div here, but I'm just going to repurpose this wrapper. And instead of using a wrapper, I'm going to put the container class there. And I also need to get rid of this closing div since I got rid of the open one. So now if I put my container here, other things won't be restricted to this width. And so I can refresh and boom, it's taking up that nice width. And these things now are inside of their own container. Okay, and I could use multiple containers wherever. Like for instance, if I wanted a container here, I could leave this element that has the background image outside of the container. I could put a container inside of that, and then I could put my content within there. Okay, so we can move around that container in order to let the backgrounds breathe and go to the full widths. Were there any other questions that you encountered while working on this? Yeah.
When I did the meter match in the middle, it shifted to the left side of the screen.
Okay, yeah, so you put like a class column 3 or whatever. Okay, the reason for that is because these things, how they work underneath it all is they're all floated left, okay? So as soon as we put that class on it, it's gonna try to take up the first 3 columns of our grid, okay? And in order to not do that, we can use a Bootstrap offset class. So we can tell it to be 3 columns wide, but we want it to offset it by 9, say, okay? And so you'd have to do some research on the Bootstrap docs to see how do you offset things in a grid. But that's possible, again, just using classes.
So offset means like push it to the other side.
Right, because remember when we look at our grid, we're starting left to right. And so in order to get it to on the other side, we have to offset it some number of columns. We can offset it 1 column to put it, say, here, 2, 3, 4, etc. Any more questions? There's all kinds of goodies in Bootstrap, so I highly encourage you to poke around with it, look at all the things that are available, use them in your projects. You know, it really accelerates your development time, especially, you know, if you're working by yourself. Okay. All right, so with that, let's talk about a few end of class things. Okay. All right, so this weekend is technically the milestone for a rough draft of your JavaScript. Now, I don't need you to turn anything in for this milestone, but this is just one where this is where you should be at. You should be at starting to write your JavaScript. You've got your HTML and CSS rough draft. You should start thinking about writing JavaScript this weekend. Next weekend, not this coming Sunday, but the next one, that's when we'll want a rough draft of the whole project. Okay? So 2 weeks from, I guess a week from Sunday is when we're going to want a rough draft of sort of the whole project. So that gives you an idea of where you should be in this process. All right. Any questions about final projects? Yeah.
Just generally, are we going to be like presenting our final project?
Great question. The last day of class is going to be pretty much all presenting final projects. Yes.
At the end of class, will we still have access to
The repository?
the repository and all of
I
this?
believe the answer is
And
yes.
even Slack?
Yes, totally. Slack. In fact, people from my previous classes still Slack me all the time, and I'm pretty much always available to answer questions. So yes, the Slack channel will stay there. I'll stay in it, and if you have questions down the line, feel free to reach out to me. Yes.
And I really know, are you gonna leave us all the screencasts and that?
Yes, I probably will. I'm gonna probably unlist them so that you guys can access them, but they won't be searchable. Okay? Because right now they're just like anybody can find them. So I'll probably remove them and make them unlisted, so they're still accessible, but they're not fully searchable. So yes, I'll probably do that. Yeah, no problem. So yeah, that's a good point. I don't know if I'd mentioned that. The last day of class is going to be presentations for the final project. The class before that is going to be a lab where we just work on your final projects, pretty much. I may do like a little talk about like, you know, where to go from here or something of that nature, but it's going to mostly be focused on making sure you're ready for those presentations. Good question. Any other questions about the final project? Again, the last milestone that was due previously was the HTML and CSS rough draft. And you know, I'll be giving you some feedback on those, you know, before the end of the week. All right. This Sunday will be the last day to turn in assignment 4. Okay. And so if you have not turned in assignment 4, please get it in before Sunday. And remember, you can miss at most 2 assignments and still receive a certificate of completion from GA. Their rule, not mine. But so make sure you're keeping up with these dates. This Sunday, I'm going to have some bonus material prepared if you want to come to office hours. I'll talk about just some of the more advanced features of Bootstrap, some of the other things that it can provide. So if you want to come on Sunday to talk about those things or anything else, please show up and we can do that. And if not, I'll circulate the slides and stuff afterwards. Let's see, what else? Okay, there is homework this weekend, assignment 7. I will open that here. The assignment this time is we're going to go back to Relaxer. Okay, you remember the fictional company that had the landing page and the blog. We're going to go back to that, and we're just going to make that site responsive. Okay, and basically a solution for the previous homeworks that we've done is the starter code this time. So when you fork this, you have a functional desktop site, and your assignment is to just make this thing responsive. And you can do either approach. You can use your own media queries and float and use layout if you want. If you want to use Bootstrap to do it, that's totally cool too. It's up to you. All right. Any questions about this assignment? Okay. And I think that may be it. Yeah, I think that's it. So if you would, please fill out the exit ticket before you leave. He's got me. Sweet. So please do fill that out before you leave. If you want to continue working on your Bootstrap assignment before you go, or make sure you can get the assignment 7 ready to go, I'll stick around for a little bit to talk to you. Nice. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's how Bootstrap is to a degree. You don't, a lot of times you don't optimize sites for people resizing screens, right? We optimize sites such that it looks good on multiple screens. And so, we don't like expect people to do a rapidly changing experience when they come to our site.
Okay, which is already cool.
They would load it and it would be that size. So that's what we're optimizing.
Either way.
Yeah, either way, it's still going to count. Unless you do something like CSS transitions, or do like animation or something like that. That's going to be a lot more involved. If you think you have enough time, I'm sorry.
No, you're totally fine.
But if you want to fit it, you think you have time and energy. Anybody else need any help? Any more kinds of comments?
Did you see my message? Yeah, that's the last day.
Okay. Yes. Was it related to that topic? Yeah, I think I did. I just
That's okay.
What was
What do I do about this?
Oh, yeah, well, let's take a look at it. Oh, right, so your question was, do you need Photoshop to sort of like resize this photo?
Is that the best way to do it, or is it, because like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, yeah, so you could use CSS to change the size of this image. Right? So we can use CSS to give that image a width, or a one together probably, so it doesn't mess with the proportion. And that will scale it down in the browser, we look fine here. However, it's not the best way, because we still need to download the entire giant live photo before we can show it. So the best way, yes, is to open it in some sort of photo editing software, get it to exactly the size you want, and then use that file. So that's the best way. However, you know, for this kind of very controlled, you know, we're showing a presentation here, the internet's pretty good, so you can use it.
Yeah, I think that would be.
This looks sweet. Awesome.
I know they're gonna take that.
Thanks. Have a good night. Thanks. You too. Yeah. Night, man. Have a good night. Good night. See you Monday.